So this part of the course will focus on explaining the evaporating cloud method, which includes defining clouds and their purpose, common characteristics, the format, defining the conflict within that format, and then defining the requirements or needs and the common objective. So starting with the purpose of the cloud, you can see here that again there's no distinction drawn between conflicts and problems, and that the cloud format will address both of those. And the objective here is to identify a practical solution. So one assumes that you're seeking a solution to the problem. It's not a problem that you would like to continue to exist. Characteristics of clouds are when developing a conflict within the cloud format, you need to work on the basis that the logic needs to be sound before you finish that work. So we use a number of logic tests to assist in that regard, but the point being that just by filling in the boxes within the format, you haven't really necessarily finished the work. And in order to assist you in making sure that that logic is sound, you need to make sure that those statements that you do use in the entities are singular and simple, and that you avoid explaining why that statement exists or you believe it to be valid. We'll address that issue of why in the assumptions, which is a separate section to the exercise. You also need to, when defining the common objectives and the necessary conditions, make sure that they're constructive, positive statements. So they're not worded in such a way that they are negative statements. And you'll see what I mean when we get into the example. And finally, ensure that the cloud reflects the problem and not something else. So it can often be the case that as you're working intently on trying to define the problem, that you move away from what was originally expressed as the problem, and so you need to constantly go back and check that you haven't done that. You haven't moved away from what was originally expressed to be the problem. So here's the original or the format of the conflict cloud or evaporating cloud. You can see that it's made up of 5 boxes, all of which are connected by arrows. D and D prime represent the conflict itself, which is really could be described as an action or a want. And B and C represent requirements that need to exist in order for that or for those needs or actions or wants to exist. And then B and C, being requirements, they also have a common objective. So what we want to do is we want to expose all of these entities in a way that it assists us in identifying what the problem is and what the common objective is and what are the requirements that we need in order to achieve each of these different points of view, which are represented in the prerequisites. You'll also see a number of other boxes that are shown here which talk about what the need, trying to expose, if you like, the reasoning behind the relationships between these boxes. We'll talk about those in a subsequent part of this course, but for the moment, just be aware that those boxes seek to identify the assumptions that underpin the relationships of each of these entities. So we'll talk about more of those later. The first thing we need to focus on is the entities themselves. So when we define the conflict, which we do in the D and D prime boxes, we do so in this way. So going back to that example of the marketing costs, who pays? Is it the owner or the real estate agent? The conflict is represented by these two boxes, and you can see through the wording that the statements are very clear and unambiguous and clearly in conflict with each other, i.e. pay the marketing costs or don't pay the marketing costs. And so it's as simple as that when defining a conflict. One is in direct conflict with the other. It gets more complicated when we start to define the requirements. You can see here we're going to define the top requirement, which is item B, and what we're trying to get is what requirement or need which is satisfied as a result of D. So the options that I came up with when putting this together as an example was that B could be ensure sufficient funds are available to market the property. So that's one option. The second is the owner has a greater influence on where and how the marketing campaign is run. Or C, maximise house owner returns. So there's no limit to the number of those that could exist as alternatives to this requirement B, but the intent is to come up with something that clearly needs to exist in order for you to take the position that you want to pay the marketing costs. The owner wants to pay the marketing costs. So I proposed one of those, and the one I chose was that if the owner pays the marketing costs, then the owner has a greater influence on where and how the marketing campaign is run, which seems to be the most compelling of those three options. And if we take a similar approach with the requirement for not paying the marketing costs, don't pay the marketing costs, then those options can be either maximise the owner returns, align payment with responsibility, or incentivise the agent with skin in the game. So I chose item C, which says incentivise the agent with skin in the game. So the logic being that if I want to incentivise the agent with skin in the game, then I, as the owner, don't pay the marketing costs. So that's the logic that I'm trying to get to here. So with those two requirements now defined, we can now turn our attention to the issue of common objectives. And you'll see here that, again, I've gone through the exercise of defining what that common objective might be, bearing in mind what we've now derived for items B and C. And you can see that I've suggested either best price possible, quickest sale possible, or maximise return to owners. And I've ended up with maximise return to owners as being what appears to be the common objective in selling a house from the owner's perspective. So now we have what could be considered to be a first pass of our conflict cloud structured in the way that it needs to be. The next step will be to validate that this logic hangs together, and so the next phase will be to test this logic, which will be shown in the next part.